You know how white people act in horror films. They just act like they're so clueless. So both Atticus and Uncle George can completely understand that this man is turning into a monster and that he needs to be put down right away. The white guy, the other sheriff that is in the room with a rifle in his hand, he's like, I don't know what the white guy's name was that got bit, but I'm gonna call him Dave. He was like, Dave, are you okay? Dave. Like, he's still in his moment. And it's so funny to me because he's still in this moment sympathizing. Like, the black guys are telling him, for your own safety, you need to shoot this nigga. You need to shoot this nigga right now. That's what Uncle George pretty much tells him. And he still, instead of listening to the two black guys, his own racism gets in the way of him listening to the two black guys. He instead tries to sympathize with the white guy with the gun, with the racist white sheriff guy with the gun that is turning into a monster that is going to eat him, and he does. And so he dies. And so essentially his own death is his own fault because he refuses, instead of to empathize and sympathize with the black people in the room who both have common denominator of survival in this moment of trying to survive these monsters, he instead sympathizes and empathizes with the white guy who is going to turn into this monster and eat him alive. What up, everybody? It is your boy Jabbar, and welcome back to my channel after after a very long hiatus. I have been gone for about a month now. It is because this is the longest time I've ever taken off YouTube before. I've only taken off like a week at a time before, or something like that, or maybe the max of 2 weeks. I took off this past month because essentially I was going back to school. I am a teacher. If you didn't know that about me from my other videos and watched them, I am a teacher. So going back to school was a little bit challenging, and so I took a month off to sort of get all of my stuff in order. But now I am back. I wanted to start this, my first days back on YouTube, sort of doing something light. I wanted to start a new series, specifically going episode by episode with Lovecraft Country. So this will be a review. I will do a review every week for this new season of Lovecraft Country. I think there's only going to be one season. I think it's supposed to be a limited series on HBO Max. I specifically got HBO Max only for Lovecraft Country. I wanted to do this with Watchmen, but I didn't have time then, and so I ended up just trying to fit everything of Watchmen, all the episodes of Watchmen, into 30 minutes, like a 30-minute long review. I don't want to do that this time around. I really want to dedicate time to doing a series where I take apart, or like pick apart and analyze each episode as we go along. And Misha Green is the director and showrunner for this show, and it is sort of being funded by J.J. Abrams and Jordan Peele. They sort of put the money up for it, but Misha Green seems to be this black female director. She seems to be over sort of the writing and the day-to-day directing and stuff like that. This story of Lovecraft Country sort of surrounds Atticus Freeman. He is our main protagonist in this series. He and actually Letitia, who is played by Journey Smollett, and Atticus is played by Jonathan Majors. They both sort of arrive back in town, in their hometown. We don't know where Letty was yet, but we do know that Jonathan is coming from the army. I think we can infer that it was World War II. Enter into this episode by way of a dream of him on the battlefield, but the battlefield turns into sort of this sci-fi sort of sci-fi sort of action flick where there's like, it's not just people fighting people with guns and tanks and in trenches, but instead there are aliens and there are monsters, and an alien comes down, and of course we're in this dream, but he wakes up when the last monster attacks. And it's sort of weird and sort of disturbing because Jackie Robinson comes out and hits a monster with a baseball bat and splits it open. I don't know what that symbolizes, but it was very interesting image. Sort of wake up to him being on this bus headed home. And he's talking to this other black woman on the bus. and they're headed back home. The bus breaks down, of course, and they have to walk the rest of the way. And he offers to help her, carry her bags and stuff like that. I thought that this episode was shot pretty well. I feel like all of the episodes are gonna be shot really beautifully. There's a couple of things I want to hit upon when talking about this episode. The first thing being about family. It is sort of like a return home type of episode, and we sort of are. I don't know. I was just entranced by how like this. So it was this little small town of mostly black people. All I saw were black people essentially. Just laughing, playing, dancing, singing, having block parties, having fun. Turning on, the fire hydrant and running through running through the water. The kids running through the water on like this hot summer day, and everybody just laughing and having a good time. It seemed it almost seems like a black utopia almost, and it was just very nice to see all these black people just so joyous and happy together, at least for the moment that we get to see them be happy together. But it's sort of juxtaposed with the fact that yes, this place is sort of a safe space for black people to exist and be in from the outside world, which is racist, which I'm going to get to later, when Atticus, Letty, and his uncle George go on their ride through the countryside, to sort of map out places and also find his father, because that's why he's coming home essentially, to find his father. We don't know why Letty has come home yet, but we understand that when they get back home, back to this place, back to this black town, where it sort of seems like everything is just so, even the color scheme of everything is just so vibrant. There are these very vibrant browns and yellows and oranges. And it just seems very beautiful and just it's very nostalgic. It's a very nostalgic type of feel. And I was really just entranced by seeing all these black people just sort of be happy. But so many times in media, we see, just sort of downtrodden and beaten upon, and the poverty, which exists also in our community as well, in black communities as well, the downtrodden and the poverty and the, messed up streets and, the indigence that goes on, because of the racism that is went on. So it was nice to see media where I don't think that this wasn't like a lavish place where they were living like, high off the hog, and it was just everything was golden all the time, but it did sort of give this place of like, even though it might not be like rich, and there's still like poverty here, black people are still joyous here. They're still having a good time here. It is a safe space for them here. We sort of when we get into the dialogue and, people start to interact with each other, specifically Atticus interacting with his family that is left, his uncle and his aunt and his niece or his cousin, and Letty, who interacts with her sister and her brother. We understand that there is some deep-seated familial issues that are going on here, some unresolved family issues that have went on. We understand that through, Atticus, from his family, there was a lot of abuse, that his father faced abuse as a child and was traumatized by that, and then therefore went on to abuse Atticus as well. We are sort of enter Atticus's home, his old home, and we see holes in the wall, and Atticus sort of shakes his head. We aren't told immediately that these were done by his father, but we learn later when him and his uncle George have a conversation at Letty's house, at Letty's brother's house, that these were from his fits of rage that he would get in, that, essentially both Letty and Atticus left because of toxic family environments. Essentially, they essentially ran away from their families, from this place, because of toxic family environments. Atticus ran away to the war. His father essentially told him some hard truths. He was very disappointed in him and didn't really write him when he was off in World War II. And he essentially told him, how you're going to go and fight in this white man's war when they're out here pretty much killing us, and you're going to get treated just the same when you get back, which, his father didn't lie. But he didn't understand. I think the point that he missed was that it's so bad at home that I'm running off to go fight in this war. I don't think he understood the fact that why his son was running away. Why? Because that was the only option that his son really had. His son really had no other options to leave except for to join the army and to join in service. Atticus actually passes some people on the way, some black men signing up for the army or standing in line because this is their only option to sort of, come out of poverty and, make some money and do something with their lives, is to join the army. And he just sort of looks at his head and he sort of looks at the person who is recruiting them in disgust, which is very telling. Like, a lot of stuff is told through us by way of images, and I really like that. I really like film directors and writers that let us come to our own conclusions about what is going on through imagery. Without having to say it within the text or within the dialogue. Like, even like the dialogue seems very smooth. Even the conversation that Atticus has with his uncle George, who is played by Courtney B. Vance. If you don't know Courtney B. Vance, he's a legend all by himself, but most people refer to him as Angela Bassett's husband. But Courtney B. Vance has been doing this a very long time. He was the original Corey. If you've seen Fences, he was the original person who played Corey in the first sort of production of that play, him and James Earl Jones. So Courtney B. Vance is a very iconic actor, been doing this for a very long time. Courtney B. Vance actually has me dying at one point in this in this episode, but I'm gonna get to that a little bit later. Back to the conversation that they have about, sort of his father being abusive. He looks at, he's talking about how the abuse that he faced to Uncle George, essentially why he ran away. He's not saying it all out he's not like laying it all out, specifically saying all this stuff that I'm saying right now, but we can infer that this stuff is going on by, how he looks and what he's saying. And Uncle George essentially says, he needs to take it easy on his dad, that he feels a lot of guilt because, he was the oldest and he didn't really protect him like the way that he should have. Not understanding that it wasn't his job to like protect his brother, but that is the fault of his father, fault of their parents for being an abusive, having an abusive household. So Uncle George lays that guilt on himself for not being protective enough. And so, I guess he's saying that his father was very small and he faced a lot of the beatings because he couldn't defend himself like Uncle George could against his father. And so, he's dealing with Atticus' father, is dealing with some traumatic issues, so be a little bit easy on him. And essentially, he's saying, well, what about? And essentially, Atticus turns to him and it says, well, what about me? What did you think about? How do you feel guilty for not protecting me? And that's sort of the end of the conversation. So we're dealing with some very, intense familial issues that I think are handled really well and are really well written into this first episode. We're also dealing with the family issues of Letty. We haven't really concretely understand why Letty ran away or where she went to, but she's back now and she meets up with her brothers and sisters. I find it interesting that her brother and sister are both very dark-skinned black people, and she, played by Journey Smollett-Bell, is very light-skinned. I think that's going to come up later on, that possibly, there seems to be a lot of talk and argument about their mother when it comes to when she meets her sister at sort of like the block party, and her sister is singing there, and she joins her sister and singing on stage, and they're dancing and laughing, but afterwards they have a very serious conversation about how like she sort of abandoned the family when mom got sick and she didn't come to the funeral. I think there is some sort of familial resentment there. I feel like we're gonna be, because both of her sister and her brother are very dark-skinned black people, and she is like light and she looks mixed. She sort of in comparison looks like, how could you guys have the same parents? How could you guys have the same parents? She seems to also be the youngest child as well. And so I'm thinking that possibly, maybe her mother had an interracial relationship with another man, and possibly that's where some of the resentment comes from. I think we'll probably get into that a little bit later. I think because Letty isn't the main focus of this story, and she is sort of a B plot or maybe even a C plot of the story, I think that her story will be woven in more later on. But right now we're getting little bits and pieces. Every time she meets her sister, they have a little bit of an argument. Her sister doesn't really argue at the party though, and she tells her, essentially, because I guess Letty needs a place to stay, and her sister essentially like, you can stay for me for a couple of days, but that's about it. I really don't fuck with you like that. She goes to her brother's house as, when her, Atticus, and George go on this sort of expedition across the country. She goes to her brother's house and they get in an argument about mom and how she didn't come and how she is sort of abandoned the family and stuff like that, and how they can be heard yelling off screen as George and Atticus are having their conversation. So we have two families both going through both having to sort of, now that they're back together, sure, they're happy to see each other again, but now it's time to like deal with some family issues because we've been putting it off and now it's just the time. So as Atticus and George are having their family issues outside, her and her brother are yelling and screaming inside about mom. I hear, you can hear Letty talking about, y'all think that y'all always treat mom like she was a saint, like she could do no wrong. And, he says, you're not going to talk about my mother like that. It's some very real, like, dialogue, like, that you would just hear people arguing about family and family deaths. It's the typical stuff that you see in a lot of black families. George Freeman is Atticus' uncle. He is married to Anjanou Ellis, her actual name, her character name. If you remember Anjanou Ellis, I did a review of the Clark sisters, the First Ladies of Gospel, before. She played Dr. Maddie Moss Clark, and now she is playing Hippolyta Freeman. Hippolyta, that name is going to come back to mean something important. I think she's going to be an important character, as we can sort of see in the previews for the next episode. She is sort of seen in this sort of garb, or like ancient sort of traditional garb or something like that in one of the clips, which I found very interesting. Also, her name is Hippolyta, and Hippolyta I think is very Greek or something or it's either Greek or Roman, and some kind of Greek or Roman character. But I forget. I don't really know. I forget the mythology around Hippolyta, but I should look that up, and I'll look that up and I'll put it in the description box below. He's married to her, and they have a child together, which is Atticus's cousin. I forget her name. But she draws little comic strips for her dad. When he goes out, he's actually a map drawer for black people. Like, if you ever heard of the Green Book, developed by Hugo Green. Hugo Green developed this Green Book. It was sort of a traveling guide for Negroes, sort of traveling across the country and especially in the South to make sure that they stayed away from sundown towns. It informed them about sundown towns. It informed them about safe places to stay while they were traveling and all that good stuff. And George Freeman seems to be another sort of traveling guide writer, and his wife helps him also. I think he also owns a library as well in this sort of black town. He goes on these trips regularly. He also alludes to the fact that some of his traveling guide writers and traveling guide runners have faced death. I think he alludes to the fact that somebody got their kneecaps blown off one time. Hippolyta Freeman and George Freeman, they have this sort of a little bit of a disagreement. It's not really like an argument or nothing like that, but she wants to be more involved in the writing and in the run and like going around and figuring out places and mapping out places. And he is like, nah, so I think it's a little bit too dangerous for you to be doing that. And yeah. But I think that their story will evolve more like I said before, we can sort of see their story really hasn't developed too much yet. except for the fact that, he is George Freeman. Essentially, he sort of lies or tells a half truth. He says that Atticus and Letty are sort of going to help him sort of map out the sort of next, sort of run or whatever, map out more places. Really, they're going to go. Really, they're also in search. While they are in sort of, kind of doing, sort of mapping out and the places where it's safe for Negroes to go and places where it's not, places where they can eat and all that good stuff and get a good meal. They are also looking for his father, Atticus's father, who has seemed to disappear. And left Atticus a note. I forget what the note says. H.P. Lovecraft is a racist in real life. A lot of his work has a lot of racist tropes in it, from what I hear and from what I've read so far about reviews of his work. And he also wrote horror stories. Jonathan Major's character Atticus essentially says that sure, yes, he is a racist, but a lot of his, I don't think that takes away from his greatness as a writer to create these stories. And that's another thing that I want to sort of get into, which is sort of the manifestation of H.P. Lovecraft's racism sort of coming home to roost. This is sort of this chickens coming home to roost type of thing that is seen to go on in this series, with the monsters coming out at the end of this episode. They're riding through town, Atticus, Letty, George, and they're riding through town. They stop at one place. Before they stop at this one place to get something to eat, they're stopping by these other places like gas stations. They stop by this ice cream parlor. We see this sort of juxtaposition of white people and black people in all of these different spots that they are traveling at. So at the gas station, of course, we have these white people standing outside making monkey noises and ee and ah and scratching their armpits at them as they're getting their gas. At the ice cream parlor, we see the black people standing on the other side waiting patiently to be served, while pretty much the store owners are completely ignoring them and only being attentive to the white people on the other side. So there's a white section and a colored section. They have to be around back, and they're around, the white people are around front, and they're eating their ice cream, talking, having a good time, and these black people have been standing there forever waiting just to get served, an ice cream cone. And they still stand there and wait there. We see billboards, we see black people waiting in line, to get work, essentially, or it's either to get work, or to put on unemployment, or to find some type of job, or to enlist in the army. I forget what the line is for, but it's a line where all these black people are pretty much looking impoverished and downtrodden, and then behind them is a backdrop of a billboard that says, the American way of living, is the right way, or something like that. And it's just the juxtapositions of how white people live and how black people live and how there are two Americas is really made clear in that moment when we get this sort of very long scene where they're driving through the South. Also is done with the backdrop of James Baldwin talking about, the way the American Negro lives in his own country that he built and all this other stuff. So I felt like that was done very nice, without it being too preachy, without it being too in your face, without it being so like, here's a lesson about American racism. But in terms of the chickens coming home to roost and H.P. Lovecraft's racism coming home to roost and having to deal with that in this piece. So we started, the trouble sort of starts when they enter this diner. George is like, I want something to eat. We're going to eat. We're American. We're American paying citizens. We pay just like everybody else. I'm going to sit right here. There's a white boy at the counter. And he's like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm sitting down to get something to eat. Letty's like, okay. Letty and Atticus are like, okay, like, oh, okay. So somebody's got big balls today. She goes to the bathroom. She hears the guy on the phone, because he refuses to serve them, and he goes back to, I guess, the office, and he's on the phone with his employer, and he's talking about, like, I told them to leave, and she hears them as she's going to the bathroom, as she's coming out the bathroom, actually. I told them to leave. I remember, I told them to leave. I don't want them here as much as you do. I remember what you did the last time, Miss Lydia or whoever it was sat down, and that's sort of where that scene cuts off, and we just leave with, Letty looking wide-eyed, Journey looking wide-eyed into the doorway, watching them have watching this white boy and his, I guess, the owner of the establishment have this conversation. Atticus starts looking around the building, and essentially he's like, Uncle George, can you tell me again why the White House was painted white? And it's a very weird, like, it was very weird. I was like, why does he want to know why the White House was painted white? But essentially George says, Uncle George tells him because that when it got burnt down in the Battle of blah, 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 insert date there. Essentially when they rebuilt it, they had to painted it white to cover up the burn marks and the scorch marks. And so then Atticus moves one of the boards and there's like burned wood up under the panels. And then Letty comes out the bathroom screaming, "Get the hell up! We gotta get the fuck out of here now!" And she grabs the keys and jumps in the car and swings it around. And Uncle George, and there's also some talk of like misogynoir in here as well, and sexism in here as well. And Letty is constantly asking if she can drive. He's like, she's constantly looked over in terms of asking where they want to stop and where they want to eat. And at one point she makes a comment like, well, just don't ask me a damn thing about nothing. I guess I'm just not important. But in that moment, she takes charge. She grabs the keys and hops in the car. And she's like, get the fuck in the car now. We gotta go. We gotta go. And essentially, that's what Uncle George is still like I don't know why he's thinking about like gender roles at this point in moment, but he's like, give me the keys, get in the back of the car. And then she's like, get the fuck in the car. We ain't got time for this. She's like, we ain't got time for this shit. Just get the fuck in the car. And and she whips that car around and she opens the door. If y'all don't get in here, and they get in here and as they get in the car, the police and these sort of, other white people with guns are sort of chasing them sort of out of the town for essentially, so I guess the word has been put out, and they're shooting at them. They're shooting at the car. They just have one little pistol. These people have rifles and stuff, the police and these sort of vigilante white people that just sort of want to kill some niggas. Barely make it out by the skin of their teeth, because then like a car, like there's a sort of like, one car is coming off of a ramp to verge onto this other street while they're coming on from this other street. And Letty thinks, okay, so if I can go right here past this car, then I can jump in front of this car, because this other car is sort of coming at the same speed. If I can jump in front of this car that's coming, this way, then they can block off the car, the police truck and the vigilante mob white people that just want to kill niggas, the racist like Ku Klux Klansmen behind them. So like she does it, and then the car behind them that actually was converging on to the street that they were coming on actually makes a sharp turn, and ends up, for what I don't know how it happens, but it doesn't even seem like the car touches the car, but both the police car and the vigilante car flip over this sort of gray vehicle that just sort of, cut them off, that cut these like racist white people off. And then, they stop the car and look back because they're like, what the fuck just happened? Did they just save us, and why? Letty, George, and Atticus look back, and Atticus and this white woman steps out of the car after like seeing both of this police car and this vigilante truck sort of tossed to the side. And this white woman steps out of the car with this red hat, and she looks at Atticus, and Atticus looks at her, and they look like they know each other. So it's like, okay, well, what the fuck is this, and who the fuck is this white woman? Essentially, Atticus looks like, oh, we need to get out of here. He looks at her like he knows it, but he goes like, drive, drive, drive. So that's the first little thing they have. She looks at him like, I'll see you again, nigga. We have unfinished business. That's what this white woman looks at Atticus like. But anyway, they drive on. They make a pit stop where they think that his father might have last been. And then a police car shows up, of course, a racist white cop. He tells them that, do you know you're in a sundown town? And essentially, he tells them that they have essentially 5 minutes, that sundown is at 7:09, and that is 7 o'clock or 702, 703 or something like that, and they have a couple minutes just to get out of town. That they can't go south, but that they can go north. And is it allowed if I make a? They has to ask him for permission. First of all, he has to degrade himself to even add. Atticus has to degrade himself. The white man tells him, the white police officer tells him, call yourself a nigger and all that stuff. Ask politely, nigger, and say, may my smart ass nigga self, please make a U-turn at the spot because I know it's illegal to make a U-turn. He has to sort of degrade himself in order to get passers-by, and he lets them try to make it to 709, and it's a really intense scene where we're given sort of the imagery of the sun going down against the trees and them sort of trying to make it across the train tracks, and it was so beautifully shot. Now it's a very terrifying scene, but it was so beautifully shot. It was so nicely shot, the back and forth of the sun weaving in and like going down, and you're just like, oh shit, oh, like there's no clock. Like usually people would do it like a timer and like a clock, and like you would be looking at like the timer run out, but Misha Green decides to do it by the sun actually going down, which also goes along with the idea of sundown town, which also I just thought was great. I just thought the imagery was great. It made for a very intense moment, and I think it was even much more intense than if I were to look at a clock ticking downwards. Oh, they do make it past. The white man does try to get them to speed up because they're only allowed to go the speed limit, so they had to ask permission to do a U-turn, and they could only go the speed limit, which is 25 miles per hour. So essentially, it's going to be very difficult for them to make it across the train tracks in just a couple minutes, which is like a mile or so down the road. And essentially, but they make it. But then on the other side, they run into some more racist white cops. They run into some more racist white cops who have, essentially they've been alerted that these niggas are riding through, I guess because of their altercation back in, where they sat at the diner, that there are these niggas riding around, that they are thieves. And so they stop them, they pull them over, they take them out into the backwoods, essentially to shoot them and to kill them. And sort of this is where the sort of chickens come home to roost. The violence perpetrated by white people sort of comes home to roost. And within these like freaky, multi-eyed monsters that sort of are almost vampire-like, as sort of Uncle George explains. And they come through and they eat these white people up. They eat these white people up, boy. Now, Uncle George, of course, is left, he falls and gets pushed down by one of the police officers, even though the police officer still gets eaten up. See, that's another thing. Like, the police officer pushes him down to get away, and instead he still gets eaten anyway by the monsters. And so these monsters, of course, come out after sundown, in these sundown towns. And so essentially the manifestation of racism within the horror stories. I'm assuming that these monsters are from one of H.P. Lovecraft's other horror books, from one of his other horror stories, and it's almost like Lovecraft's own creations, based, sort of seeped in his own racism, are coming back to sort of haunt this sort of new universe that these black people are in, and also really come back to, put their foot in their ass in these white people as well. So even when, the white sheriff or whatever, pushes down Courtney B. Vance, Uncle George Freeman, he still gets eaten anyway because of his own racism and greediness and selfishness and lack of empathy. His own racial violence comes back to bite him in the ass. All of their own racial violence comes back to bite them in the ass. Uncle George ends up still, even though he gets pushed down, making it because he has the flashlight. Because he was thinking on his feet, because he sort of, he notices the fact that, these monsters, they sort of, retreat at the sight of light, that they are that is sort of their kryptonite in a way. So he carries the flashlight with him all the way to the sort of abandoned cabin where Letty, Atticus, and the two white officers that actually have made it, that are still alive, are at, and they're hiding out at. One of the police officers has been bitten on his arm. His like whole shoulder is gone. His shoulder is gone and just sort of hanging there. And he starts to, Uncle George is like, he starts looking at him, and he's like, "This is the funny part of this is the funny part of this show." This is the funniest part of this show, when Uncle George looks at him and he's like, and Uncle George says, "Remind me again what happens to people that get bit by vampires." And Atticus says, and Atticus doesn't say anything at all, because it's sort of a rhetorical question. Because we all know what happens to people who get bit by vampires. They become vampires themselves, and essentially, this white man is turning into one of those monster creature things, and he's just going, and and then Courtney B. Vance goes, he goes to the other white officer in the room. "You need to shoot him right now." And of course, the white guy gives the most white peopleist response. The most, like, how white people act in horror films. They just act like they're so clueless. So both Atticus and Uncle George can completely understand that this man is turning into a monster and that he needs to be put down right away. The white guy, the other sheriff that is in the room with a rifle in his hand, he's like, I don't know what the white guy's name was that got bit, but I'm going to call him Dave. He's like, Dave, are you okay? Dave. Like, he's still in his moment. And it's so funny to me because he's still in this moment sympathizing. Like, the black guys are telling him, for your own safety, you need to shoot this nigga. You need to shoot this nigga right now. That's what Uncle George pretty much tells him. And he still, instead of listening to the two black guys, his own racism gets in the way of him listening to the two black guys. He instead tries to sympathize with the white guy with the gun, with the racist white sheriff guy with the gun that is turning into a monster that is going to eat him, and he does. And so he dies. And so essentially his own death is his own fault because he refuses, instead of to empathize and sympathize with the black people in the room who both have common denominator of survival in this moment of trying to survive these monsters, he instead sympathizes and empathizes with the white guy who is going to turn into this monster and eat him alive. And it's sort of, and I just thought that this was brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. If this isn't a way to show how not only is racism detrimental to black people, but it is detrimental to white people, that they will even, self-destruct themselves because they hate niggas so much. They will even add to their own destruction. They will even add to their own, they will cut off their nose to spite their face because niggas might benefit. So he doesn't want to give Uncle George the gun, or he doesn't want to shoot his friend because he doesn't want to be the only white guy left with two niggas. And he doesn't want to sympathize with the two niggas who are focused on survival in this moment because there's fucking monsters outside. And one of his friends has been bitten by monsters and is turning into a monster. He is so fucking racist that he cannot, he doesn't have it, he really doesn't, he lacks all inability to sort of just have basic survival skills. Maybe just for this moment, I could not be racist for a moment so that I could, me and these niggas could get up out of here. He has the cognitive dissonance. It's just crazy. And I think it's beautifully done and beautifully portrayed and displayed in this moment. And none of that is like spoken. I hate stuff. I hate film. I hate cinema. I hate TV where they treat every episode like an after-school special. Listen, the best things are not said, but they are seen. At the end, sort of how they get out, essentially, as you probably know, Letty goes and she runs and she gets in the car and she turns on the headlights and she drives back to the place, and with all of the flares that they packed when they first left, for the road trip, to sort of do the traveling guide and also to find his father. And they throw the flares all around, and they survive until morning, until they can walk, and they end up in this place, this mansion, and this white guy comes out essentially is like, we've been awaiting you. And it's sort of, I think it's the brother of the girl that was also in the car. So that'll be interesting to see next week where this goes. I feel like there's going to be a lot more chickens coming home to roost sort of things happening throughout this. I feel like that's what this, I feel like that is what's going to connect a lot of these pieces, that we're not just going to be dealing with one set of monsters, that we're going to be dealing with multiple monsters that H.P. Lovecraft created, and how they were rooted in racism, and how these sort of, the racial violence that he sort of put in his own books and his own literature is now going to manifest into racial violence that affects not only the black people in this film, in this sort of mini-series, a limited series, but also the white people as well. Let me know what you guys think about, possible outcomes, or what you think is going to happen in the next episode. Tell me what you think about this episode, if you liked it, if you didn't like it. What did you think there were like some faults in it or some plot holes in it? I mean, there's of course going to be plot holes because they're not going to take everything the first episode. But let me know what you thought about it, and I'll see y'all next time for the next video. Out.